So we have 4 renders. Effects building shadows are essentially the effect of the rising dust, smoke onto the building. As you can see for this render pass, we do have the building going kind of below ground, so we'll need to fix that. We also have a second render pass, which is called effects ground shadows, and that is the shadow pass from the dust that's coming from the wind or the downdraft of the helicopter onto the ground. Okay, but this particular pass kind of goes under the building, so we'll also need to fix that. And as I mentioned earlier, we have our gray shaded proxy geo renders of the building, and we have the same thing with the ground. So with these 4 elements, we can use one against the other, shape, if you like, the 2 render passes from Houdini in order to give us what we need. For the wall, what we'll be using is the whitish, very fuzzy mask that we see rising against the wall. And here we'll use the luminance values here that we see as a mask. And both of these masks we'll use to color correct the plate to simulate the effect of this dust on the ground and on the building, creating a bit of a shadowing or darkening of the plate. So let's get started with the ground. So we have this. We basically need to trim this with the building. So the building's alpha channel is like this. So if we were to take this ground shadow here, take this building, and we're going to merge both together. Well, we want the building to be in the A pipe and the B pipe be connected to the ground shadow. And of course, we can disconnect, connect the B pipe here and do this. Or simply we can select the node and Shift X to be able to reverse the order of the nodes. By doing that, we're basically placing the building on top of the ground shadow, but we want to not do that. We don't need the building. We want to use this as a mask to cut the ground shadow. So in the operation here, we're going to set this to stencil, and easily we get what we need. So we'll be doing the same thing here with the effects building shadow, which is this pass, but this time we want to use the alpha of the ground render of the proxy geo for the ground, which is essentially just a plane. And we're going to use this to cut what we don't need here. So here I'll select this for this. I'm going to be working on first. So selecting this, click this, M, and reverse the order X. So here I will do the same thing here again. Instead of over, I'll set this to stencil. And so in the end, I have the shadow onto the building, which is exactly what I want. And I also have the shadow on the ground, which is exactly what I want. And I'm going to merge both of these passes together. And as you can see, we're not really using any alpha channel. We'll be using the color information in both of these passes, or essentially the luminance value of these 2 passes here in order to generate a mask that both connects the ground and the building in one unified shadow pass. So how do we merge both? I'll put the, I'll get this, these 2 blocks here, and then I'm going to merge both of those. So select this, and then hit M. I'll set this to screen. As you can see, this pass is rendered at a pretty low tempo. It's pretty noisy. And the reason we've done that is just not to incur long render times. We're going to be using just the luminance, the brightness values of this to create a shadow. So we don't need super high precision. And this pass is most likely going to be blurred a little bit in comp. So what we can do is to try to denoise that a little bit. We could use the built-in nodes that we have in Nuke to try to denoise that. And as I'm working, I do have a habit of saving my work, kind of a muscle memory at this stage. So you can see here at the very top, it says that this script has been modified. You can see it in the square brackets. You will get that as soon as you make a change after you first save. So we've made so many changes now. So let's go ahead and save this. Okay, so now let's try to see what we can use to denoise that. There are multiple denoising tools out there, but let's see if we can use the built-in denoising node. Type denoise. And you can use here, I'm using a pretty old GPU on this workstation. I don't need anything very super beefy for Nuke at this stage, unless I'm doing machine learning or something like that. And I would be using something like a 4090 on a different workstation. By default, this denoise node has a box, which is essentially a sampling area. So why don't we move this to the area here that has a little bit of noise? So we're working with a digital source, yes. Noise model is modulated. It's not constant, it changes all the time. And in the noise analysis here section, once we place this noise, this box over an area which has a visible amount of noise, we can just click on analyze noise and see what we get. So this can be refined a little bit more. I'm not going to spend much time refining this necessarily. I just want to remove the most visible noise, and maybe let's try to analyze maybe a different area here. So you can increase change the frequencies that it catches. You can see here as I'm changing the high gain, it's removing the super high frequency noise. We can push this in the medium as well, and also in the low. We don't really have low noise, no low frequency noise here. But we can also increase the denoise amount to filter this out a little bit more. And to be honest, like as I said, what we really need is just to get the white stuff a little bit cleaner than what we have here. And that should be pretty much all I need at this stage. And you can feel free to obviously, you know, increase the smoothness, play around with the filter a little bit more, just to try to get rid of more of the noise if you wanted. Kind of have what we need already. So let's go ahead and save that. All right, now that we have this already set up, we're going to use a backdrop to think of it as a post-it note. Select all of that. Backdrop. Backdrop is a grouping mechanism. And if you click on the top of the backdrop, you can move the notes, but you can also control clicking here. I can recenter my backdrop. We're going to give that a name. We're going to call that shadow passes. So this will take a text here, put a text in the top left. And so when we zoom out, that becomes fairly handy to know exactly what is what. So let's just change the color in this backdrop a little bit. Something a little bit more neutral. I'll just reduce the saturation right here. And that's going to give me a nice little gray color here, which is all I need. So what do we do with this? Well, several things. First, I want you to pay attention to the fact that this render here has what we call an overscan. You can see that even though the resolution of the image is HD 1080, the render that you have here is actually slightly larger. And the reason for that is we need to compensate or need to take into account the lens distortion that comes naturally with the plate. So this was shot with a real lens. It may not look like that to you, but any lens that you're going to be using has an inherent amount of distortion. It could be very, very minimal, usually for lenses that are a little bit longer than your focal length, the focal length of the human eye beyond 50 millimeter. Typically, modern lenses don't exhibit a huge amount of distortion. However, for wider, wider, and ultra wide lenses, you will always have a more consequential amount of distortion. In this particular plate here, there is some distortion. And as I mentioned earlier, we don't know. I couldn't get hold of the data. I don't know what lens it was filmed with, but we kind of did a guesstimation, during the camera tracking process, and we're able to derive from the tracking process a distortion map, which we will be applying to the computer generated elements in order to make the computer generated elements match the distortion that we see here in the plate. We'll just put a grade node here, pressing G, and pressing N. We're going to name it. We're going to call it, well, I'll just put it in caps, shadow CC for color correction. So this shadow CC has a mask input, which I will connect to the result here. And the input of it is going to be connected to my read node here, our plate, our main plate. Now that we have both connected, so we're going to try to extract a little bit more of that luminance. So I'll just put a grade node right here. And in fact, before we even do that, we try to figure out if any one of the channels here is a better candidate to use as a mask to do the shadow color grading on our plate. And by analyzing the red channel, you can see there's some difference between the reddish wall and the whitish values here. We'll look at the green channel. That difference is even more obvious. And in our blue channel, it's probably the greatest difference between the values that we want to keep and those that we don't want to keep. So why don't we try to grade down? We can use a gamma. Because this mask is going to be used, this image is going to be used as a mask. I don't necessarily need it to be going over 1. Think of it as values between 0 and 1. So just to prevent that by mistake, this can happen. I'm just going to white clamp the values here. And I'm just going to gamma down a little bit until I get something that looks more or less like that. I can bring down my white point a little bit just to amplify the whiteness or the more solid values in here. And to be frank, that's pretty much all we need. We do have some stray values here and there on the top. We can always garbage matte that out if we need, using a node, a roto node. So here I just press O on the keyboard, and very quickly we can create a garbage matte just around the values on the top here. Something as simple as that. I just press the Enter key after creating my last point here to close the shape. And I can just use a blur node on the shape, B for blur, and I can use, so the idea here is to create a very soft mask, which we can then use to stencil the rest of the top here, which has values that we don't really want. So I'll just do this really quickly. I can go to the very end of the shot and of course bring this shape out because we're getting values that we want to keep there. Let's go in the middle of the 2 keyframes, something like that. It's soft enough that even though it's kind of eating into some areas that have values that are between the whitish values and the ones that we don't want to keep, but that should do the work for what we need. So let's go a few more frames back. So if I go around 1430 and further on, I'll just take that shape and kind of keep it somewhere here. It's not too precise what I'm doing. It's just, and we may need to adjust that if we feel like maybe some areas of the shadows are being clipped by our shape. But now we have this garbage matte shape. We'll put this right next to the grade node. We'll rearrange that right there. And we're going to create a merge node. So select that, hit M. And let's connect that, Shift X. And we can basically set this to stencil. So the idea again is to take this and garbage matte out, remove the values that we don't want, something like that, okay? I can do, of course, the shadow color correction on the plate now that we have things set up here, but I don't have anything that's on top of that shadow. And typically you would be shadowing or grading the plate and then putting something on top of that shadow. But typically you would want to do that while looking at layering of the additional element on top so that when you make the shadow color correction, you want to calibrate it or to make it look correct while looking at the final result. So we're not doing that just yet. So I'll just for visualization purposes, I'm going to enter the shadow here, shadow CC node here, and I can basically bring down the gain overall. But you can see as I do that, nothing happens. That's because the information that we want to use to create the darkening is in the blue channel, as you can see it here. And our blue channel is not the channel that we are using in our shadow CC here. By default, the mask is set to alpha, or RGBA.alpha. So it's expecting that mask to be in the alpha channel. Well, we could just have to switch it to the RGB.blue. And now if I take the gain down a little bit, you can see the shadowing starting to happen both on the ground and on the building. One thing to be aware of is that we don't want to be darkening something that's already dark, right? You don't want to overshadow something. So we'll need to do something extra, constrain the shadowing only on the exposed areas of ground. Anything that's shadowed from the building here, we don't want to touch. So let's look into doing that now. We could try to use a keyer for this to extract the luminance value of the ground and only of the ground. And for this, we'll just type tab here. Let's connect that to our plate here. And let's see what the default values are. So if you press A on your keyboard for alpha, we see that the values we get are darkish where we want them to be, but not completely white where we want them to be white. We can play around a little bit with the A value here, bring that down, bring the B value down. You can use the click in here and use the wheel on your mouse to do that. This is producing the inverse of the result that I want. I would like all the shadowed areas to be completely white and this open area to be black. So we can massage the values a little bit. 0.02, 0.02 in A, and then in B, 0.08, more or less. And we end up with something that kind of looks like what we want, but we can inverse the values here, inverse the result to get the ground to be black and the shadow to be white. You'll notice that we have two things that are not exactly where we want them to be. We have quite a bit of noise everywhere, and we also have some values that are not completely white. Basically, all the buildings there, we want to use that as a bit of a garbage mat, if you like, to cut this mask that we see here. We want to make sure that this shadow is not affecting the existing shadow that we see in the plate, like what we discussed before. And so to make sure that this happens, that we don't get this noise here, we can try to go use the same method and denoise that a little bit. We can denoise the plate and see if that works. We can also blur the plate and see if that affects things. So why don't we try blur? Try blurring the image before it gets keyed. And we can try a value of maybe 3, something like that. And let's take a look at the result. And we see that this has a positive effect. It still hasn't gotten rid completely of the noise, but we can process that a little bit further by crunching our value in A. And that gives us more or less the result we want. It's not perfect in terms of, preserving all the details, but it is good enough as a mask. And obviously here, this does not do a very good job. However, we do have the effects building render, the proxy geo, which we can combine with this mask in order to get a fuller image. All right, so here's this render. You can put the alpha channel of it, which we will combine with the rest. Let's bring our luminance mask key here. So we're just going to combine them. We'll just merge that one with the other. And this, we can even move this node to the side here to bring it a little bit closer. And if we look at the result, we're basically filling in the areas, not completely. We'll take care of this area a little bit better in a second. But we are actually getting rid of the black values here by merging that on top of. And so when we do that, we are left with some areas that are not completely clean. I'm thinking we could potentially try to use a additional garbage mat or fill in those areas. I'm going to the very last frame. I want to fill in those areas that are semi-white by having a bit of a shape that goes like that. We don't need the shape to be super precise. We just needed to fill in just those areas a little bit better. Something like that should be good enough. So as you see, I'm going along just the areas where the mask is not perfect, and we can close our shape here. Because I've created this on frame 1500, if I go to a different frame here, that frame is not going to hold. It's static, and you see it's going to travel across, and it's essentially only going to do its job for frame 1500. Well, I mean, of course, I can go back and keyframe this, go back, move the shape, etc. We can do it that way, but we're going to use a 3D projection of that roto shape onto a 3D building, which we already have as a 3D geometry, and we're going to render it with the camera, the 3D camera that came with the shot. So for this, we're going to type read geo. In the file input of that, the file field of that node, I'm going to go click on the little folder here. I'm going to navigate to my shot directory, and I'm going to go to geo. And here we have BHK010 proxy geo v001. That's the one that I want to bring in. So I'll just say open. We don't need the asset heli. There's a proxy helicopter there. We can turn that off by clicking on the little orange swatch on the side. We can turn this one off, the sky thing here. We only care about the proxy geo1. And once we have done that, we can create an all-in-one node. And to view this node, we select it and hit 1. And because it is a 3D node, we instantly get into the 3D viewport. Around, we have the buildings in the front here, and we have a bunch of buildings in the back, and we also have a ground plane. We can turn on the headlamp to see this a little bit better and turn off the grid. That is the geo that we'll use to project our single keyframed roto. And we also need a camera for this. So let's go and open the camera node. And we're going to go to the file section here, or we can actually do this from the main tab and click on read from file. And we're going to bring in the camera for the shot. So we're going to navigate into the cam directory, and we have in here the Alembic camera, which we'll select and click on open. And if we wanted to view the 3D geometry through the camera, we can select that camera from here. It's called camera 1. And as we scroll through the timeline, we can see the proxy geo. Now remember, we did the garbage matte on frame 1500. So I'll call it F1500G matte. Okay, so this way it's clear. What we want in order to project things onto the geo, we want to freeze this camera. We want to use a static camera as the projector. Think of it as a lamp. So we're going to frame hold at 1500. You can see here we have a frame hold. I'm going to hold the camera at 1500, and I am going to use a project 3D node, frame hold of my camera. The output of this is going to go into my geometry. And the second input of the project 3D node is going to be connected to my garbage matte here. And when we view it through the camera, you can see here we have this black shape that's tracking with the camera. And this is exactly what we want. Let's take a look at how we can get the final result of that mask by using a scanline renderer. And that scanline renderer will take an object/scene. Well, here our object/scene 3D object is our proxy geo here. It also takes a background input, which we're not going to use. However, we're going to use the camera input of this scanline render. As you can see here, it says cam. And we're going to connect this to our camera, which is up there. So we can just connect this here like that. And I'm just going to keep things a little bit square and organized by clicking on Control on my keyboard and clicking on one of the dots here to create a dot in the middle of the connection here. And exit the 3D view by typing Tab. I can now see the result of my rotor shape projected onto the 3D building, actually moving around with the camera. And that's exactly what I wanted. So that's one way of avoiding having to set keyframes on your rotor shape, and just simply use the tracking information from the camera to create an animated mask. It is this mask that we are going to combine with the existing Lumi key of our plate. Combine all of these three masks together. So the luminance key from the plate, the alpha channel from our proxy render of the building, and our extra shape here. You can see like we're plugging in the empty holes that we didn't want. And of course, we can always readjust the shape at frame 1500 if we feel that maybe we should grab a little bit more of the extra details here, something like that. Gonna bring this in, just to clean it up. It's not super essential because back there, we're probably not going to see the back of the very rear of our shot there through all the smoke and dust, etc. that's going to be flying around. However, it's a bit cleaner, and that should really do the trick for what we intend to use this mask for. Okay, so I'll close this, and I'll just rearrange my nodes a little bit better. I'll just take, these are stray nodes that I had brought in earlier, so I'm going to move this to the side. I'm going to move that to the side here, and I'm just going to rearrange all my nodes a little bit. Just keep things clean and organized. So as you're building your script, you don't start piling things left and right on top of each other, and it quickly starts becoming messy. So I'll move my shadow passes here a little bit more to the side. I'll bring in my 3D projection into the mix right here. This is a merge node that goes in here, and this is a luminance mask. And just to avoid having kind of stray diagonal connections, I'm a little bit, how should I say, I like order in scripts. So I will create a dot here in the middle, right here, and I'll connect that to that, bring that node, bring that connection down a little bit, and keep things straight, nice and clean. I can then extend the size of my backdrop a little bit to include the 3D projection. I will control click on the backdrop, move it up, and there we go. So we have our shadow pass, including a 3D projection, and we are going to use this now. I mean, it's already set up. We will be using this to create our shadow color correction on and off. But right now it's a little bit rough, it's a little bit dark. But if you remember, we said we're going to be using one thing to cut to ensure that the existing shadow in the plate is not affected. So we need to look at what we're doing here to avoid double shadowing that we're doing here. Okay, so let's take a look closer at how to refine this now. One thing that we forgot to do is we left the connection between the 3D building and the stencil. We essentially want to use this as the mask that goes, the second input here. Instead of using this as a input, we now want to use the output of this as the A input. So all we need to do is to shift this connection away from this single node and to bring it into that merge node like so. We can move this around like that. And now that we have done that, we get basically the shadow pass, the shadow render here cut by the shadow of the plate. You can see this projected shadow from the building is now cutting our ground shadow pass, which is exactly what we wanted. And now if we take a look at the result, selecting this here, you can see that now we have a shadowing that's happening. Ooh, don't worry too much about the fact that this is kind of crunchy here. We'll fix that in a minute. But you can see that now the shadowing is only on the ground. And we will need to make sure that we don't get this kind of hard double edge here, fix the crunchiness here. And that's easily fixed by playing around with the blurriness of luminance mask that we get here, or how hard it is. And we can easily control that by adding two nodes. Select these two nodes, move them up. We'll add a blur and a grade, B and G. The grade node needs to be set to alpha because we are going to be manipulating the alpha channel. I want to make sure that we click on white clamp when we do that. And before that, we have a blur. We can set that blur to alpha only, and we can blur the alpha channel more or less. And we can also threshold it or control the hardness of it. So we'll blur it a little bit, and then we'll use a grade node here to control how much of that we're expanding or contracting through a simple gamma node. Here, if I control the hardness through the gamma, I can control very precisely how much of it I'm trimming, how well that connection is going to be made. So now that I have that, take a look at go down the tree here. So we're denoising that a little bit, we're grading this a little bit, and we are great. So one of the render passes here, the effects building shadow, is a little bit crunchy. So we'll probably need to blur this a little bit. I'll put a blur on that. It's okay that it's not super sharp. If we take a look at the result here, we have our shadow pass on the ground. We have our shadow pass on the building. Let's take a look at the effect of that shadow grading on and off. So we have a bit of a hard line here. As you can see, this is due to the fact that we're using the 3D building. It's a very sharp edged shape. So we can simply blur this building pass a little bit. So we have our rendered building shadow pass here. We blurred it a little bit. And we also have this render proxy geo, which has been occluded by the building itself. What I propose we do is that we are going to blur that ground pass a little bit. Blurring it also affects the blurring of the alpha, which is then used to stencil our building pass. And we'll put a grade node right after this, and we'll set this to alpha, white clump. We'll make sure by white clumping, again, we want to make sure that the alpha channel remains between 0 and 1. We don't want to go over 1. We are going to control the softness of that connection right there in order to minimize the hardness or hard edges that we saw earlier. So let's go back to our final color grading. So if I turn this off and on, you can see the shadowing happening a little bit on the wall here, which is kind of what we want. It's not creating this really hard edge at the bottom here. And it's also affecting, the shadowing is also affecting the ground here where the helicopter will be falling. We have a bit of shadowing happening on the wall here, which we will fix with another garbage mat. We'll do that next. We also have something that's looking very hard and kind of clumpy or kind of noisy here. So we can just blur the shadow pass a little bit. Not so much, just enough to get the right value or the right look here. So this looks a little bit weird to me. It looks very artificial. So let's go and analyze what it is that we're getting here. So what's very important is to make sure that no value goes above 1, because this is only going to be used as a mask. So the mask itself needs to be between 0 and 1. A simple way to do that is to ensure that here those values are clamped as a safety. So all channels are going to be minimum 0, maximum 1. That's exactly what we want. Let's go back to the blur value here for our ground shadow while we view the result as a shadow CC. So we can soften that shadow a little bit just so that we get the right look for our shadow color correction on the ground. So I'm trying to see what the right level of softness would be. We basically need to match that level of softness because this is indicative of what would happen in reality. So we'll go to a value about 5 that should more or less do the trick. What's very important is to make sure that the color, the average color that we see in the shadowing, you can see if I Control Shift select a range of pixels, we have values of 0.24 in red, 0.13 in green, 0.007 in blue. So what this means is that our shadow is slightly red. So we need to try to get the shadowing here of on the ground from the helicopter to be more or less the same values of, to my eye, this looks slightly green. So what we'll do in the shadow CC, we've taken the gain down to about 0.38. And here's another way of looking at this. Shadowing is what exactly? It's an absence of light. It's an underexposure. It is a change in exposure of the nominal value. We can, of course, analyze this in terms of value, red, green, and blue, but we can also analyze it as we would do on the lighting set in a photography studio, using a light meter and measuring the exposure value or EV value that we have speaking in the shadowed areas. We go in the very, very dark portions, we are almost 5 stops under what we call nominal exposure. So if you were to expose a 18% gray card perfectly, this would be your reference value exposure. So if we look at that value here, almost 5 stops below a perfectly exposed gray card, 18% gray. 18% gray, by the way, why 18%? Because to our eye, 18% gray would look as a middle gray, the way our brain would interpret it. So that's the logarithmic nature of light response into our brain. So if I look into this area here, where we have shadowed a little bit away from the very, very deep shadows inside the building, we have about 3.5 stops of underexposure. As the helicopter crashes and lands in here, we need to have something that approaches that value of underexposure. One thing I forgot to mention is that if you are going to be using the spot meter here, which you can select in the bottom right of your viewer, you have to make sure that the center f-stop setting for your viewer is correctly set. So for this, we'll put our mouse in over the viewer. We'll press S for settings. And the center f-stop, sometimes I've seen the default value be 8, but in our case, we want this center f-stop value to be 0. And if it was at 8, as we see the default sometimes in Nuke, it will give us the incorrect reading. So let's set this to 0. And actually, let me show you what it would look like if we had the default value here. It would show you a t-stop or f-stop at 1/48th of a second shutter speed. So we don't want that. We want to make sure that this is set to 0. Let's try to find a frame where we have a little bit more of that shadowing from the helicopter, something like 1450. Okay, so try to bring the exposure down, minus 3.5 stops, so we can bring our gain down a little bit. It doesn't need to be exactly the same darkness. It could be close to it, something like that should be okay. And as we do that, you notice we can always control that edge. We do have control for that through the various nodes that we built earlier. Let's try to get the color to sit right. We have something that feels a little bit greenish, so we can use the multiply values here to try to fix that. So we can expose up our correction just to make sure that it's not green, or needs to be pretty much the same kind of color. Let's see if we bring the blue down a little bit. I think I was changing the values here in the wrong node. So let's reset those back to 1. And we're going to modify that actually in the right node. So we go into multiply here, and we can increase the red value. There we go. We can see the change now. So there we go. Make this a little bit more red, not so much. We can use our eye to try to gauge whether this is too green, or not enough. This is obviously too magenta. So I'm going to bring it right around the right value. And as you can see, I'm using my up and down arrow on my keyboard to change those numbers. So wherever the cursor is, if I go up, you can see I'm introducing new digit. If I go in front of the 6 and go up and down, I can change things very quickly this way without having to This is a very precise way of controlling how things look. So as you can see, if I zoom out, you can see there's a bit of a discrepancy here. This is starting to look magenta, whereas this is starting to look a little bit more yellow. So that means in my green here, or in my red, I probably went too far. So I'm going to bring this down a little bit, get a little bit more red. I think just these values should be. This is still looking a little bit green, so or a little bit too red. All right, so let's say this is an acceptable value, more or less. We may need to adjust this, try to see what it looks like once we have the elements on top of it, but the shadowing setup is essentially done. We just need to refine this edge here a little bit, just to make sure that we don't introduce a discontinuity with the existing shadow and the one that we are creating here. So I'm going to zoom in more into these two nodes here because that's the key to getting our edge looking a little bit better. So here I can modify the blur value a little bit, but more importantly, I want to change the gamma value here in my grade 8 here. So open both nodes. We can harden or soften that edge with this control here. So if I make it 12 or between 8 and 12, that should be a good value. We can change where that edge, how far out this edge extends. So very simple tools, quite effective. And I've also darkened the shadow pass a little bit further. So in doing that though, we have to be careful not to make the building too dark. As you can see, I combined the ground shadow with the building shadow in one pass. You can see now I'm darkening the building a little bit too much. One way to tackle this is to go back to the source here. And for our building shadow, we can introduce a grade node and we can balance the gain of that, the strength of that building shadow to where we want it to be, something more or less strong, and without undoing everything else that we've done in our setup. I can go ahead and maybe blur this. I can see a bit of a black edge here, or dark edge, and maybe soften that a tiny bit. And there you go. So we have our shadow set up. We want to make sure that we save our script. In fact, now that I've reached this critical point in our compositing history here for the shot, jokingly, we can go into File. We can say Save New Comp Version, Alt-Shift-S. And when I do that, notice what happens to the version number at the very top. You can see it says BHK10 Comp Version 02. So that's one way of versioning up. And we're going to start now putting the CG passes together. Oh, before I forget, before we talked about lens distortion, but we now need to apply the distortion to this image so that the masks match the distortion that is actually in the plate. And the way to do that is to use an ST map. So we'll bring in the ST map. It's a single frame. So we'll read it in, so type R. And we're going to go to the camera directory. And we have the undistort and distort. So we are mostly interested in the distort. And it essentially looks like a gradient, right? It looks like a vertical or horizontal red and green ramp. So these two ramps create this image here. And they essentially think of it as a UV type map where basically if we had a perfect gradient, each pixel would be aligned very linearly from left to right, top to bottom. But with the distortion, it may not be visible to your eye, but the arrangement of pixels here is slightly different than a horizontal and vertical gradient. It is the positioning of each pixels here, which is slightly disturbed from their original state, which Nuke will understand in order to create a distortion. So we'll bring in this image and we'll type stmap, right, which is a transform node. In the stmap branch, we'll connect that to our stmap, and the source is going to be the image that we are going to be distorting. Here, we bring these two nodes down there. Let me extend the backdrop a little bit. Connect this to our image. In the stmap itself, we want to affect all the channels, or it could be the RGB in our case, but let's set it to all. The UV channels are going to be in the RGB. This is the RGB image that we're going to use to introduce distortion. So if we look at this before and after, you can see what the effect of the ST map is from the camera in Houdini, but we're now applying this to the image, essentially bringing back some of the pixels that light outside of the picture area back into the image, but in a non-linear manner. As you can see, most of the distortion is visible primarily around the edges, but that's exactly what we need. After applying this distortion, that's the output we're going to be using to do the shadow correction. So it's pretty subtle, but it's important enough to have the distortion reapplied to everything that is computer generated in order for things to track properly. So if we have something that is distorted, layered together with something that is distorted, these two things are not going to line up, especially when we get close to the edge of frame. That's when the potential for sliding, things not lining up properly will occur. And that's depending on the movement, depending on the perspective, depending on what the camera does in any particular shot, that can become fairly obvious and problematic. So applying the distortion here to prevents any kind of mismatch. So we have now done that. Let's now move on finally to the rest of the composite for this shot.